the title of the paper, I should emphasize this is joint research and very preliminary with Katusha and João Paulo, and Carolina has also been involved in the project, and they'll be presenting other aspects of the research of the broader project. But this is a joint paper with João Paulo and Katusha. And we're coming out of a project and a book about Walmart in Latin America. And so our presentation is really is a reflection on the research agenda and the issues raised in part by the Walmart experience. And as the title tries to capture, the problem noted by activists and advocates and scholars about Walmart in a broader social context was that its everyday low prices model squeezed suppliers, was anti-union, had negative consequences for small business, and it had for economists many negative externalities and many social costs, which led to sort of broad scale efforts to oppose and to regulate. In the title of a recent book, in Everyday Low Prices was Walmart's own slogan. The Cost of Free Shipping was the title of a 2020 volume, really the first comprehensive examination of Amazon by mostly labor scholars, mostly looking at the global north. And it was titled The Cost of Free Shipping. And the connotation of that is very much that there is a social cost, including a labor cost, to be paid for consumers receiving in 1 or 2 business days their goods, in a wide variety of goods that they previously would have bought in bricks and mortar retail or by other forms of shopping. So the spread, and there are a lot of similarities between the companies. I'm going to go on to my next slide, if you could, please. The overarching question is, what happens to labor standards and wider social costs when a powerful multinational spreads overseas? Because as was true with Walmart from the early 1990s, from the late 1990s and particularly into the beginning of the current century, Amazon too has looked overseas. And going to the third slide, the overarching theme is that there is a problematic encounter between a multinational with a kind of diffusionist strategy, which is to say, trying to export and transfer fairly intact its home country practices and model, business model and labor model, to different national country contexts and markets and institutional schemes. And so that encounter can generate a lot of friction and conflict, and agents on the ground nationally, be they labor regulators or trade unions or civil society organizations or competing firms, often engage in actions that try to put limits on Amazon's reach and power. So going to the following slide, we ask what sort of lessons we can learn, because the Walmart experience generated a lot of empirical evidence as well as critical scholarship from really around 2005 onward, about first the company's impact domestically, but increasingly looking at it overseas as it spread really throughout across continents. And Amazon has done something similar. And theoretically speaking, we're informed by a long standing literature about the problematic nature of multinational host country interactions. which was primarily developed around manufacturing and other sectors, but can also be applied to commerce and the service sector. We're informed in terms of a comparative perspective that's also cross-regional by gradual institutional change theory in comparative political economy. And in the background is the idea of varieties of capitalism, and basically that different countries have different ways of organizing markets, of regulating activity, of organizing labor markets and labor relations, and that despite globalization and convergence pressures, those still exist, those legacies still matter in important ways, and they're an important starting point for considering Amazon's spread overseas. And thinking about the usefulness of the comparison as a point of departure without trying to mechanically put the firms into the same box, both have been very norms transgressing disruptive firms based in large measure on their innovation and logistics. They have wide-ranging impacts through supply chains and on competing firms, including firms trying to sell goods through Amazon's platform. They're characterized as American firms by strong resistance to unions and unionization and collective worker voice. Although we had the first breakthrough in the United States on Staten Island last spring. And a lot of the resistance that's happened domestically in the US because of a unfavorable labor relations environment has taken place really outside of traditional unions and outside the traditional National Labor Relations Act framework. Through labor civil society and labor community kinds of coalitions, both at the local and national levels, and through activism that hasn't necessarily taken the form of attempting to formally unionize and conduct elections, like with the Amazonians United. Going on to the next slide, Amazon has in really some ways, even though it starts much more recently as a company, has been more precocious and aggressive in its internationalization compared to Walmart, if you compare the company trajectories. And already by measures like the UNCTAD's Transnationality Index, which measures the foreign share of revenues, employment, and assets, has surpassed Walmart in terms of its level of internationalization. By the end of 2021, over 31% of its direct global workforce, leaving aside subcontractors and those who in effect work under Amazon's direction but don't work for the company. So 31% of its direct global workforce is overseas, which surpasses that of Walmart, around 27%. And if we look at its physical footprint, the largest facilities are these giant warehouses that they call fulfillment centers. 47 today, as of this month, 47% of Amazon's fulfillment centers are outside the United States, and 46.7% of the square footage of those huge facilities are outside the United States. In the table in the following slide, slide 7, you see kind of a snapshot of where the fulfillment centers exist now in terms of countries, as well as the ones that are planned in the foreseeable future and have been announced by the company. So Amazon, we tend to think of it as a US firm, but it is truly a multinational, and being a multinational has been present since very early on. Here in the following slide, we see Amazon's global employment, which is somewhere around 1.3 million, and the sort of vertiginous growth that's taken place in the last decade or so. Now, as part of that expansion, Amazon has come to Latin America, notably to Brazil and Mexico, in terms of being its first countries with e-commerce platforms and with the building out of a distribution infrastructure, starting with these huge fulfillment centers, but also working to with smaller facilities like delivery stations, and then building out the last mile in terms of having direct control over that important stage of getting the goods quickly into the hands of consumers. So already, even though this has all taken place since around 2015, we find that Brazil and Mexico have comparable numbers of fulfillment centers to longer standing European markets where Amazon is, France, Italy, Poland, and Australia, which is a more recent country of entry. Reportedly, they're going to open fulfillment centers and begin e-commerce sites in Chile and Colombia, but nothing has been formalized. So if we look at these waves of global expansion of Amazon, we'll see that Latin America really fits into a third wave that includes, not only since 2015, that includes Australia, Middle East and North Africa, other countries in Asia outside the initial countries, some additional EU countries in Western and Eastern Europe. But most important of note, they failed and pulled out after massive investments in China in 2018. And you can see there rumored expansion for next year, including Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as further expansion in Western Europe. So quickly going through some of the analytical comparisons, both companies have tended to be highly centralized and to not have a lot of subsidiary autonomy, or treating them as separate profit centers in terms of their accounting structures. Quickly, Amazon has moved, compared to home country model, to developing the last mile. One thing that we have to be attentive to is the fact that Walmart had many problems with markets where its model did not seem to be a good fit with business regulations, consumer preferences, and labor regulations. That's coming in a slide, but it exited 7 different G20 economies. But what's the nature of the grievances of its workforce, and how do they relate to the productive models? Well, as Amazon expanded domestically, a key focus, like earlier with Walmart, was negative local impacts on labor markets and on wage norms, because being a large so-called monopolistic or buyer of labor power in these local labor markets where it sets up distribution centers, which are giant facilities. But more recently, as Amazon has raised wage rates, we find working conditions, high stress, high turnover, much higher than average accident rates if you compare by the industry norms, as well as all the issues that are basically related to algorithmic control. And then these were all exacerbated by COVID exposure issues for the workforce. So questions that are raised as we look at Amazon overseas is, at what phase do we find these different labor markets in Latin America? Amazon would seem to be in a buyer's market for labor with high informality, and significant rates of unemployment. But is that does that change the nature of the locus of conflicts? We're still trying to find out the evidence in terms of we know that many of the workers are temporary and seasonal hires, and that seasonal employment can double existing employment around Prime Day or around the holidays. But beyond that, we still don't know for Brazil which of the many different contractual forms created by flexible labor reforms Amazon is using. And an open question is whether Amazon is modifying its practices, which initially took advantage of previous outsourcing norms that were changed dramatically by a 2021 reform in Mexico. And I know there are other panels that we're going to address this issue more generally in Mexico, and I'll be interested to see if they have any evidence. But Amazon announced that it would be changing its heavy reliance on staffing firms, which were its main initial model. But whether or not that's true in practice, we still don't know. So finally, I just want to note that, you know, we have to be attentive to the fact that Walmart's model was of everyday low prices, of squeezing suppliers, of trying to establish market dominance and drive rivals out of business or into a smaller place in the market, didn't work in a variety of different important markets, including eventually in Brazil, in Argentina, within Latin America, but also other countries in Western Europe and in Asia.
1 minute, Scott, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Jorge. Seeing the failure after extensive time and investment of Amazon in China, we have to, and the fact that Amazon, as is true in China, faces significant locally established competition, we have to be and has not yet exerted a sort of market dominant position like Walmart rapidly acquired in Mexico over its first decade in the 1990s there. Significant competitors are Mercado Libre, which is an Argentine multinational, multi-Latina, which is present in both Brazil and Mexico and throughout the region. We have locally owned firms like Magalu. We have traditional retailers who've gotten into e-commerce. Walmart itself in Mexico is a big e-commerce player and competitor of Amazon. So it's by no means a foregone conclusion that Amazon will be able to dominate those markets the way it has the United States e-commerce market and some of the Western European markets that it moved into early on in its trajectory. And finally, I'll just end with this point. If we compare Brazil and Mexico 5-7 years ago, we would say Mexico, restrictive labor laws, protection contracts. Now we have a progressive labor law reform, and we have an outsourcing law. Brazil, the reverse picture, from a flexible labor market reform after some progressive tendencies earlier in the century, and a government that's been hostile to labor rights and is seeking further flexible changes depending on the results of this pending second round election. So we have to consider the dynamic institutional trajectories and what kinds of levers and resources they put at the disposal of those who would seek to regulate or in some way resist or push back against the expansion of these powerful American anti-union multinationals.